Detailed outline for Theme 6. The molten glass of the blown vessel. Navigating chronic hot-tempered reactivity, explosive anger, and the somatic reclamation of temperate transparency. Act. The multi-sensory present the escalating temperature approx. 800 words. Atmospheric sensory calibration. Opening with acute, stressful modern multi-sensory data, the harsh metallic clanging of a subway terminal, the relentless blare of gridlocked traffic horns, the sharp neon blinking of unread high-priority emails, and the ambient friction of a heated boardroom debate. The sudden rush of body heat, the sharp, audible intake of breath, and the heavy slamming of a fist or a door. The modern dissatisfaction. Unpacking the contemporary epidemic of hyperreactivity, toxic cancel culture, and everyday road rage. The modern glorification of immediate responses, where assertiveness is confused with aggression, and where the mind is permanently conditioned to treat minor daily inconveniences as direct existential attacks. The universal we. Connecting the listener to the shared, deeply regrettable experience of losing control, saying words that cannot be unsaid, breaking valuable relationships in a flash of blind rage, and feeling the painful, hollow hangover of shame that inevitably follows an emotional explosion. Introduction of the primary metaphor. Introducing the central metaphor. The mind as a superheated industrial furnace, where the molten glass are liquid emotions and raw silicon impulses, pushed down a tight iron blowpipe under extreme internal pressure, expanding violently until it threatens to shatter the lungs and the life of the artisan creator. Act. Deep symptom anatomy, the archetype of the exploding furnace approx. 1,500 words. The archetype of the volatile producer. Introducing a highly relatable modern archetype: high-achieving executive, perfectionist leader, or stressed parent who masks deep underlying control anxiety behind a persona of quick-tempered dominance, burning through professional partnerships and leaving a trail of broken domestic trust. Somatic mapping of volatile anger and interpersonal reactivity. Tracking the precise, destructive biological tax of chronic rage within human physiology, the sudden, massive rush of blood toward the face and temporal lobes, causing the temples to throb and the ears to ring with a hot, localized pressure. The violent, rigid clenching of the masseter muscles and the jaw, fracturing tooth enamel and creating systemic headaches. The rapid, heavy and shallow chest breathing that deprives the brain of carbon dioxide equilibrium, trapping the nervous system in a high-voltage adrenaline spike. The severe, tight knotting of the solar plexus and the immediate bracing of the hands into tight fists, ready for structural combat. The psychology of reactive dominion. Dissecting the behavioral psychology of explosive anger. Analyzing why the human brain naturally utilizes rage as a defensive armor to avoid facing a deep, terrifying layer of personal vulnerability, grief, or perceived helplessness. Surgical wisdom melting the second arrow of reactive rage approx. 1,500 words. The strike of the second arrow. Introducing the foundational Buddhist insight regarding primary and secondary experience. The first arrow is the raw, unedited discomfort of life: an insult from a colleague, a cancelled flight, or an unfair accusation. The second arrow is our self-inflicted psychological disaster. The massive explosion of righteous indignation, the obsessive mental rehearsal of revenge, the destructive retaliation, and the heavy secondary layer of intense self-loathing and shame that consumes us after the outburst. Deconstructing the illusion of the dominant self-non-self. Utilizing rigorous philosophical analysis to dismantle the angry identity, showing that the persona of the powerful, terrifyingly fierce protector is merely an empty, impermanent psychological construct built to defend a fragile ego. We are destroying our coronary arteries and burning our relationships to defend a phantom that doesn't exist. The liberation of inherent unsatisfactoriness. Reframing interpersonal friction not as a personal insult directed at our character, but as an undeniable, universal characteristic of a chaotic world. Recognizing that we cannot force the external universe to bow to our expectations, and that attempting to do so is the ultimate spiritual stagnation. Dissolving attachment to control. Examining attachment as a white-knuckled grasp on how others should behave, showing how this rigid expectation cooks our blood and turns our inner space into a volatile furnace. Act IV. Transformation architecture cooling the molten core approx. 2,000 words. The practice of somatic annealing. Providing a concrete, step-by-step meditative methodology to down-regulate the survival brain and cool the liquid silica, the jaw and throat softening. Directing thick, warm awareness into the masseter muscles and the larynx, consciously separating the teeth to dissolve the mechanical brace of rage. The open palm protocol. Training the nervous system to physically extend the fingers and open the palms flat during a conflict, instantly disrupting the brain's motor loop of aggression. The practice of the thermal buffer, the sacred pause. Implementing a psychological protocol to catch the temperature spike before it reaches the vocal cords. Training the consciousness to sit inside the raw, vibrating heat of anger without acting, allowing the adrenaline wave to peak and subside naturally. The discipline of non-retaliation. Cultivating the art of intentional silence, remaining completely still and unmoving when the external world attempts to pull a reaction from our pride, treating the insult as a wind that passes through an open window. Redefining strength as temperate transparency. Shifting our internal metric of power from external dominance to internal unshakability, moving from an existence that asks, "How can I conquer this person?" to one that asks, "Am I clear and transparent enough to let this friction pass straight through me?" Act V. Temperate transparency. The clear-blown vessel approx. 700 words. The return to the raw vessel. Returning the listener to the immediate, unedited physical reality of the present moment, the slow, cool, and effortless movement of air through the nose, the stillness of a jaw that no longer needs to bite, the serene transparency of a mind freed from the heat of battle, the emergence of unshakable clarity, describing the profound liberation of living as a beautifully cooled, pristine glass vessel, strong, perfectly balanced, and completely clear, allowing the light of the world to pass straight through its center without causing a single fracture. The mind rests in its native state as a cool, boundless sky. The teacher's final exhortation. Recalling the ultimate wisdom regarding our innate capacity for absolute internal freedom, independent of external provocations or environmental stress. The echoing unanswered inquiry. Concluding with an expansive, open-ended question designed to reverberate within the listener's awareness long after the narrative ceases, dissolving any remaining sparks of reactivity. Proceed to step 3. Please let me know if this structural blueprint aligns with your goals, and I will begin generating the continuous, label-free narrative text for the first movement. We carry this intense structural burden into the very center of our lives, watching our vitality burn down to a fine gray ash under the high-pressure demands of a transactional world. Yet a deeper, visceral shift begins to unfold within the silent theater of our shared consciousness. To completely unweave the smoldering tethers of our creative burnout, reclaim our intrinsic inspiration, and escape the exhaustion of constant self-monetization, we must hold our immediate experience entirely still under a sharp, uncompromising light of reality. We must look directly past our professional identities, our data dashboards, and our digital metrics, and dissect the precise psychological laws that cause us to actively participate in our own inner incineration. When we trace the origins of our deep background anxiety and creative depletion, we discover that our suffering rarely stems from the objective reality of our workload or the changing landscape of our industries, but from an invisible, lightning-fast loop of self-inflicted mental torture that operates beneath our conscious awareness. Thousands of years ago, a profound psychological insight was observed regarding the nature of human pain, teaching us that whenever an unexpected crisis, a professional setback, or a seasonal drop in creative energy occurs in our lives, our biological frame is instantly struck by a specific sequence of dual experiences. The first experience is the raw, unedited event itself, an unexpected market shift, an algorithm change that reduces our visibility, an empty white canvas that yields no immediate ideas, or the simple physical exhaustion of a long week. This initial touch contains no personal failure or inherent malice. It is simply the natural friction of a dynamic, non-linear world, bringing a localized sting, a flash of genuine fatigue, or a moment of authentic confusion that passes through our experience like a sudden cloudburst across an open valley. Yet, almost instantaneously, before the echo of that first event has even faded from our nervous system, we pick up a heavy psychological weapon with our own hands and repeatedly drive it deep into our own consciousness. This secondary strike is our elaborate internal commentary, our obsessive overthinking, our toxic self-blame, and our terrified projection of future destitution or artistic irrelevance. The first event causes a basic, manageable discomfort, but this second strike creates the vast, drowning ocean of our psychological suffering. When a project underperforms, a metric drops, or an afternoon passes without production, that is merely the first touch of reality. But when we spend the subsequent weeks lying awake at 3 o'clock in the morning, viciously telling ourselves that we have lost our talent, meticulously scripting 32 catastrophic scenarios of professional ruin, and agonizingly punishing ourselves for being a real, limited human being instead of an omnipotent creative machine, we are actively delivering the second strike to ourselves. We become both the torturer and the tortured, trapped in an exhausting loop of identity warfare. We fail to realize that our systemic burnout does not come from the genuine tasks of our creative or professional landscape. It comes entirely from the immense volume of secondary editing, performance anxiety, and status maintenance we choose to inflict upon our minds. We are not suffocating because we are successful or passionate. We are suffocating because we are trying to force a wild, living fire to burn according to an industrial timetable. If we trace the trajectory of this secondary psychological weapon to its ultimate point of origin, we inevitably discover that our entire modern cage of monetization and metric addiction is anchored to a single foundational illusion: the myth of a permanent, isolated self that must be beautifully curated and defended at all costs. We operate under the unconscious, unquestioned assumption that there is a solid, unchanging entity called my career, my talent, my reputation, or my creative brand sitting at the very center of our lives. We treat this fabricated persona like a fragile glass sculpture, believing that if we show an unedited flaw, experience an uninspired season, or allow our productivity velocity to drop, this sculpture will shatter into pieces and we will cease to exist or matter to the collective tribe. This is why our modern decision fatigue and creative drought feel so terrifyingly existential, and why choosing to rest feels like a matter of absolute survival. We are not just navigating ordinary livelihood. We are carrying the immense, exhausting burden of believing that we must permanently manufacture and protect a static ego construct. We forget that this rigid, high-status identity we are destroying our physical biology to protect is not a permanent monument, it is a conceptual ghost. A fluid, ever-changing mosaic of temporary thoughts, professional roles, social agreements, and passing mental states that has no fixed core. By treating this ghost as a permanent reality that must be constantly fortified through hypervigilance, we doom ourselves to a lifetime of defensive warfare against our own nature. To completely break the power of this illusion, we must open our eyes to the overarching, liberating truth of absolute impermanence, realizing that the very nature of reality is not a static ledger to be managed, but an unceasing, fluid tapestry that weaves itself anew with every passing microsecond. Every atom in our physical vessel is in a state of continuous, ecstatic exchange with the living world around us. The cells of our heart, our skin, and our lungs are constantly dying and being reborn, and the very breath we draw in right now was once the breath of ancient oceans and distant forests. Our creative ideas, our professional titles, our financial assets, and our most intense anxieties are not solid boulders, anchored in our consciousness. They are ephemeral currents of energy, rising from nothingness, dancing for a brief moment in our awareness, and dissolving back into the silence from which they came. When we understand this deeply, the frantic, white-knuckled need to control every thread of our financial and creative future completely evaporates. We realize that a sudden creative drought, a career restructuring, or a shifting lifestyle pattern is not a permanent stain on an unchanging identity, but simply a single, temporary wave passing through a changing sea. There is no permanent innovator self to be ruined by an ordinary change, and there is no static future to be permanently secured by an endless monetization of our joy. The landscape of tomorrow is written entirely in water, and our attempts to carve our certainty into it with the dull knife of overthinking is a form of madness that only ensures our present misery. Let us look closely at the true nature of this mental grip we hold so tightly, for we oft confuse our chronic performance, anxiety, and passion monetization with dedication, responsibility, or high artistic standards. In the quiet corridors of our minds, we tell ourselves that our intense worry over metric maintenance is a reflection of our commitment to growth, or that our frantic monetization of every hobby is a sign of our personal optimization. But under the clinical, compassionate gaze of raw awareness, we see that this grip is not driven by love, responsibility, or true inspiration. It is driven by a deep, terrifying undercurrent of resistance to the natural changing flow of life. It is a tight, white-knuckled grasp on a highly specific, idealized projection of how our lives must look in order for us to feel allowed to rest. We are holding our breath, demanding that the natural atmosphere of reality stop moving so that we never have to face the vulnerability of being seen as simply human, resting, and empty. This attachment to constant output is a form of spiritual stagnation, a rigid refusal to allow our lives to unfold in their own majestic, unpredictable, and often seasonal timing. When we demand that our creative expressions and our data dashboards follow a perfectly linear, ascending script, we are suffocating the very life force out of our existence. We are trying to preserve a living forest. By turning it into a hyper-efficient logging mill, we may generate a predictable stream of short-term commodities, but we ensure that the living ecosystem is permanently reduced to a wasteland of grey ash. The moment we fully comprehend the absolute futility of this resistance, a profound structural shift begins to occur within the depths of our consciousness. We begin to see that our overthinking, comparing, and transactional mind is like a small, frantic creature barking at a passing thunderstorm, completely convinced that its noise is what keeps the sky from destroying the house. The storm of life moves according to vast, natural systemic movements that have absolutely nothing to do with our intellectual anxieties, our spreadsheets, or our curated filters. When we realize this, we can finally experience a deep, systemic drop in our internal electrical voltage. We can look at our unfinished career trajectories, our real human limitations, and our completely uninspired afternoons. And we can look at the wild uncertainty of our modern society. And we can choose to lower our weapons. We can step out of the war room of our comparative intellect and stand nakedly in the open field of immediate, unadorned reality. We can feel the precise millisecond the mind tries to pick up that second weapon of self-judgment, and with a soft, spacious breath, we can simply choose to let it drop to the floor. We no longer need to look at our human lives as a commercial product, to be optimized and marketed, but as an incredible unfolding mystery to be lived, trusted, and experienced through the intelligence of an open, undefended heart. This drop in voltage allows us to notice the immediate space around us with an entirely fresh quality of perception, recognizing that the prison of the gold filigree and the ash of the creative engine only exist as long as we continue to tighten the wires and rub the dry wood together under forced pressure. The moment we refuse to give our finite attention to the phantom metrics of accumulation, the golden handcuffs lose their locking power over our biological systems. We can feel our chest wall expanding with a new, raw permission to breathe, realizing that our value was never something that could be captured by an executive title, calculated by a financial ledger, or contained within a digital profile. Our true value is the very field of awareness in which these passing symbols and seasonal cycles occur, an unclassifiable, boundless depth that remains completely untouched by whether we are visible or invisible to the digital crowd. We are ready to move past the exhausting defense of an idealized creative ghost, to leave the cold, white light of our monitors behind, and to step directly into the practical architecture of our own somatic reclamation, discovering how to anchor our wild, wandering minds into the solid, unembellished sanctuary of the physical present. We sit here in the heavy, warm quiet that follows the shattering of our lifelong illusions, feeling the initial drops of a deep psychological downpour clean away the dust from our internal windows. We look at our empty hands and see that by refusing to hold up the heavy, silver-lined mirrors of public validation, our fingers have finally relaxed their frantic, white-knuckled grasp. The realization that our digital ghosts are completely bloodless, and that we have been systematically starving our raw biological frames to feed an insatiable, simulated identity, leaves us in a state of pristine, uncarved stillness. But this stillness is not a vacuum. It is a fertile, spacious valley where the real labor of somatic and cognitive reclamation begins. To step completely out of the mirror maze and establish an unshakable sovereignty over our everyday consciousness, we must design an inner architecture that is highly practical, fiercely disciplined, and deeply anchored in the tactile truth of our physical vessels. We require a method to transition from being the exhausted curator of our reflections to being the living, breathing ground upon which reality spontaneously unfolds. This active transformation begins at the absolute baseline of our biological organism within the immediate, non-negotiable landscape of the physical frame we are inhabiting right now. Whenever we notice our attention being pulled upward into the electrical storm of the cerebral cortex, whenever we catch our fingers twitching toward that pane of black glass to check our digital visibility, or whenever the internal jury begins to prosecute our ordinary human flaws, we must instantly execute a somatic countermaneuver. We do not try to argue with our thoughts, because the analytical intellect loves nothing more than a circular debate. Instead, we completely withdraw the fuel of our attention from the mind and drop it like a heavy stone straight down into the pelvic floor and the deep center of our gravity. We feel the dense, real pressure of our sit bones anchoring into the chair, the weight of our thighs pressing against the cushion, and the firm, unyielding support of the floor meeting the soles of our feet. We take a slow, deep, continuous breath, deliberately driving the air past the frozen armor of our chest wall and deep into the soft, expanding basin of the lower abdomen. As the belly swells like a gentle wave, it physically stretches the vagus nerve, sending an immediate chemical message of absolute safety directly to our survival brain. We consciously allow the shoulders to drop away from the ears, feeling the long, dense trapezius muscles soften their chronic vigilance. We track the release of tension as the tiny, hot knots at the base of our skull begin to loosen their grip, letting the head rest in its natural, skeletal alignment rather than straining forward in a posture of permanent evaluation. We consciously open the jaw, allowing a pocket of empty space to form between the upper and lower teeth, and we let the tongue drop away from the roof of the mouth, resting softly like a sleeping creature on the floor of the oral cavity. We are establishing a biological shoreline. By anchoring our awareness in these heavy, visceral sensations, we prove to our nervous system that the present room is entirely secure, and we create a solid platform from which we can observe the frantic movement of our comparative thoughts without being swept away by them. Once we are firmly anchored on this biological shoreline, we can turn our attention to the visual field and begin retraining the very mechanics of how we perceive the world around us. Because we have spent years staring into the narrow, high-density focus of digital screens, our optic nerves have become hyperstimulated and structurally narrow, locking our minds into a state of sharp, aggressive concentration that naturally breeds evaluation and anxiety. To break this neural pattern, we practice the art of the peripheral gaze. As we sit here, without moving our head even a millimeter, we slowly and consciously open the outer edges of our vision. We allow our eyes to soften their focus on the object directly in front of us, and we invite our awareness to expand outward, to include the entire physical room, the soft shadows in the corners, the texture of the walls beside us, the space above our head, and the flat ground beneath our knees. This simple neurological shift from central focus to peripheral open vision instantly deactivates the sympathetic nervous system, shifting our brainwaves out of the rapid, anxious patterns of identity defense and into the deep, slow frequencies of environmental presence. We are no longer looking at the world as a consumer or a critic searching for a frame to capture. We are simply allowing the immediate space to paint itself upon our retinas, resting as a passive, silent witness to the unglamorous beauty of unmonetized reality. With our bodies grounded and our eyes softened, we are now prepared to dismantle the mirror maze of our thoughts through the precise cognitive practice of objective mapping. When we are lost in the loop of digital comparison, we completely merge with the internal commentary, believing that we are the insecure voice that feels inadequate or the perfectionist director that demands a flawless display. Through the discipline of bare awareness, we create a clear, luminous wedge of space between the observing consciousness and the passing mental phenomena. As an evaluative thought rises from the dark waters of the mind, instead of hopping into the chariot of its narrative, we stay firmly rooted in our bones and apply a silent, onward structural label to it. If the mind begins to whisper that our life is less successful than the filtered lifestyle of an online stranger, we do not engage in self-defense. We simply name the process in our mind, comparing. If the intellect begins to design a highly curated script for our next social interaction to hide our vulnerability, we gently label it, editing. If the memory drifts back to an unpolished moment from our past, trying to recarve our image, we stamp it, remembering. This precise, unemotional labeling acts like a powerful solvent on an industrial adhesive. It instantly strips the thought of its structural authority, transforming it from a terrifying, absolute truth into nothing more than a temporary pixelated cloud of mental moisture passing through the vast open sky of our awareness. We begin to realize that our thoughts have no native power to make us suffer unless we actively give them our breath, our belief, and our muscular tension. As we master this capacity to watch our thoughts pass without eating them, we unlock the strength to practice a deeper, more radical quality of internal discipline, the capacity to sit comfortably with the incomplete picture. Our modern culture has infected us with an acute intolerance for ambiguity, an agonizing need to know how our story will end, how our image will be received, or whether our choices will yield perfect security. This intolerance keeps us in a state of chronic, hyperactive manipulation, permanently adjusting our behaviors, our projects, and our expressions to force a predictable outcome. We must counter this exhaustion by cultivating the art of sacred non-striving, an internal posture where we completely drop our hands from the loom and allow our unpolished human lives to sit in their natural raw state. Think of a deep wilderness pond that has been violently stirred up by a passing storm. The mud from the bottom rises to the surface, making the water completely brown, opaque, and turbulent. If we try to clear that water by stepping into it and using our hands to scoop out the dirt, we only succeed in making it infinitely muddier. But if we simply sit quietly on the shoreline, keeping our bodies entirely still and leaving the water completely untouched, the heavy sediment naturally settles to the bottom through its own organic gravity, and the pool becomes perfectly transparent, reflecting the true moon with absolute crystalline clarity. Our minds operate under the exact same structural law. When we have the courage to stop fixing, stop filtering, and stop editing our presence, the background confusion of our identity dysmorphia naturally settles. The true, authentic path forward reveals itself not through the frantic calculations of the comparative intellect, but through the spontaneous, quiet crystallization of our innate bodily intelligence. To anchor this transformation into the practical fabric of our modern existence, we must establish a boundary around our attention, initiating a daily ritual of voluntary invisibility. We must recognize that our attention is the most sacred, precious currency we possess, and that we have allowed it to be systematically hijacked, fragmented, and turned into profit by digital architectures designed to keep us looking into the mirrors of comparison. We commit to a discipline of structured digital fasting, carving out unnegotiable zones in our day where our black glass screens are completely banished from our sight and touch. During these sanctuaries of silence, we retrain our nervous systems to find absolute completion in the microlayers of ordinary, unmonetized life. When we wash a ceramic bowl in the sink, we do not allow our minds to float forward to our digital profiles or backward to our professional anxieties. We bring our entire universe into the warmth of the soapy water against our wrists, the smooth weight of the clay in our hands, the rhythmic swirl of the sponge, and the crisp sound of water splashing against stainless steel. When we walk down a crowded city street, we refuse the urge to pull out our devices to immunize ourselves against boredom instead. We open our peripheral gaze and actively feel the physical impact of our heels striking the concrete, the temperature of the wind moving across our ears, and the raw, unedited symphony of humanity passing by around us. We are reclaiming the dignity of our primary experience, discovering that a human life does not need to be documented, archived, or validated by a network to be entirely sacred, luminous, and complete. Let us feel the immense, weightless liberation that begins to pour into our bodies as we commit to this practical architecture of the open hand. We look inward and realize that we are no longer standing before the mirror maze of our lives as terrified, hypervigilant security guards, desperately trying to polish every reflection and hide every human crack from the world. We are standing as the very space through which the changing tapestry of reality moves, fully responsible, deeply engaged, yet completely untethered from the white-knuckled need for visual perfection. We see that our true value was never something that could be contained within a digital profile, measured by an engagement algorithm, or captured by a camera lens. Our value is the boundless, unclassifiable depth of this immediate breath, an internal sanctuary that remains completely unbroken whether we are celebrated or forgotten by the public crowd. We can take a deep, spacious breath, we can let our shoulders drop completely into the earth, and we can allow our hands to open wide, ready to step out of the narrow blueprint of our thoughts and into the vibrant, unadorned landscape of our actual existence. The lingering warmth of that expanding breath stays with us, grounding our weight firmly into the floor beneath our feet. As the complex machinery of our chronic volatile reactivity and explosive anger finally grinds to a complete liberating halt, we can feel a profound change occurring right here in the physical perimeter of our cells, a deep structural softening that signals the arrival of a completely new state of human consciousness. The invisible iron bands that have bound our masseter muscles, our tight throat, and our pounding temporal lobes for decades seem to melt away, allowing the skull to balance effortlessly atop the spine like a drop of morning dew resting on a lotus leaf. Our chest, once a hot, collapsed fortress of shallow adrenaline-driven breaths and protective shielding, opens up into a vast windswept valley where the lungs can expand and contract with the ease of cool, slow ocean tides. The tongue remains soft on the floor of the oral cavity, the jaw remains completely loose, and the skin across our forehead becomes as smooth as the surface of a wilderness lake on a windless night. We are no longer a frantic producer trapped inside a sweating, superheated industrial furnace of our own making. We have stepped out of the exhibition entirely and are standing under the immense, unblemished dome of an open, natural sky. In this deep clarity, we realize that the mind is not a volatile pressure cooker or an explosive kiln that needs to be constantly monitored, contained, or defended against criticism, but rather a transparent mountain pool that reflects everything while remaining completely untouched by the images passing across its surface. We watch our remaining reactive thoughts arise, glide through our awareness, and dissolve back into nothingness. Exactly like white clouds moving across an infinite blue firmament without leaving a single scar or scratch upon the sky, the frantic need to conquer the next conversational opponent, the agonizing pressure to force an immediate and defensive display of dominance, and the exhausting compulsion to look for external control, are replaced by a monumental, unshakable self-sovereignty. We feel a profound, inherent safety in the simple fact of our own existence, a realization that we do not need to purchase our safety or our right to rest through perpetual hypervigilance or aggressive retaliation. The world before us loses its razor-sharp edges of personal threat and environmental friction, transforming instead into a beautiful, shifting landscape of pure potentiality, where every single choice is no longer an existential crisis, but a joyful, creative movement of our native, unfiltered, and perfectly cooled intelligence. This is the great baseline of immanent groundedness, the temperate transparency that has always belonged to us, waiting patiently beneath the loud artificial architecture of our fears and our defensive personas. We see now that the entire universe is an intertwined, living fabric that weaves itself in perfect harmony, and that we are an organic, inseparable strand within that magnificent design, requiring no structural combat to be worthy of our place. When we drop our weapons and flatten our palms, we are not abandoning our lives to chaos. We are trusting the deep evolutionary current that has sustained us through every heartbeat, every breath, and every hidden transition of our lives. We understand that we possess an internal resilience that is fully capable of letting the world pass straight through us without causing a single internal fracture, meaning we no longer need to exhaust our precious life force by living in a state of permanent mobilization against imagined attacks. We can walk through our modern, high-friction environments with a heart that is profoundly spacious yet entirely unshakable, responding to the challenges of our careers and relationships with absolute clarity, unclouded by the heavy baggage of secondary righteous indignation. As we prepare to transition from this quiet sanctuary of contemplation back into the active, moving theater of our daily modern lives, we carry this luminous stillness within our marrow like an invisible, unyielding compass. We remember the ancient, timeless encouragement left to us by the teacher of teachers, who urged us to be islands unto ourselves, to be our own light, and to look for refuge nowhere but within the immediate, raw reality of our own nature. We are reminded that the ultimate potential for liberation and absolute internal stillness does not belong to a distant era or a special class of ancient sages, but is a living, breathing reality encoded into the very mechanics of our present-day flesh and consciousness. The unedited provocations and daily frictions of our lives will continue to present themselves to us day after day, choice after choice, but we will never again mistake a passing surge of heat for the baseline of our identity. We are the boundless, transparent space in which the entire tapestry is happening, completely free, completely whole, and completely at peace in our own unembellished skin, acting as a beautifully cooled glass vessel that allows the light of the world to shine through without breaking. So let us stand at this final threshold of our shared journey, letting the quietness settle into the deepest recesses of our being, and ask ourselves this one essential question to carry into the waking world. As we step back into the relentless rush and volatile friction of tomorrow, will we continue to stoke the destructive fire of our inner furnace, or will we finally have the courage to lower our weapons, open our hands, and rest in the clear, unshakable sanctuary of our own temperate transparency?